A warm welcome to everybody that's arriving. We're just letting people into the call and we will start shortly on the hour. Thank you to those of you just arriving. We're waiting for a quorum and we will start the discussion on the hour. Super. Well, here we are. Welcome to this discussion on climate finance and philanthropy beyond carbon offsets. Hello, I'm in the UK at 3 o'clock. So good afternoon to those of us in Europe. Good morning to those of us in the US. So we're thrilled today to welcome everyone to this discussion to think about the opportunities for foundations on net zero, the just transition and impact strategies that go beyond carbon emissions. I'm Sarah Teacher. I'm Executive Director at the Impact Investing Institute in the UK and the moderator of today's event, which has been organised by Alliance Magazine and Mercer. And we at the Institute have a programme of work on impact investing endowments in the UK. We're particularly proud of a guide, Why Do It and How to Get Started. And I was very pleased to sample a taster of it in an article in Alliance on impact investing in the endowment. So there'll be that link will be put in the chat. So that's sort of my part in this world. And this topic of impact investing endowment meeting the urgency of today is central to my day-to-day work. So just a bit of scene setting. I don't need to tell you that institutional philanthropy is in a significant moment of change. The Rockefeller Foundations, the Carnegies, the 100-year-old pioneers of today's professional philanthropy, they created a model where 95% of investments were in the capital markets, optimizing for financial return, and 5% were distributed as grants delivering impactful work. That was the classic model. But over time, this has become fundamentally challenged. The issues we face today, climate change, biodiversity collapse, inequality, people are asking, why are social purpose organizations only thinking about impact with 5% of what they are? And the wonderful Clara Meller of the FB Heron Foundation described this classic model somewhat provocatively as philanthropies being a sort of hedge fund with a small giving fund attached. And, you know, what's the investable assets of this hedge fund? Well, in the UK, there's £72 billion worth of AUM in grant-making endowments. In the US, there is over $1 trillion of charitable assets. All of this great majority is classically invested in the balanced portfolio with little to no impact considerations being taken into account. And as a UK foundation put it, it's like being in the solar system and focusing all of your energy on one planet and ignoring the power of the sun. So that's what we're doing today. We are looking at the sun and we're thinking about how it can be optimized for urgent action on climate change and the just transition. And goodness me, have we got a superb panel to do that with. With me today are Ellen Dorsey, Executive Director of the Wallace Global Fund and President of Divest Invest Philanthropy, Martin Rich, Chair of the Endowment Committee at Access, the Foundation for Social Investment here in the UK, and Hill Gaston, UK Head of Sustainable Investment at Mercer. A few things before we begin. Chat. First off, I've seen some of you already doing it. Please feel free to say hello to one another in the chat on the right-hand side of your screen and post any questions there. And you can join the conversation on Twitter by tagging @AllianceMag and @Mercer. and subscribe. So everyone here is welcome to subscribe to Alliance at a 20% discount with the code EVENT22. Just see the offers tab on the right-hand side. I'm a subscriber, and Alliance did not ask me to say this. It is my go-to for the insights, critique, and trends on philanthropy, social investment, and impact investing globally. It's a superb resource, and I really commend it to you. So we are going to start proceedings with remarks from our three panelists before we get into the juice of getting you as audience members to ask questions of our esteemed guests. We're going to kick off with Ellen Dorsey. Ellen is an activist and partner to movements that are advancing economic, environmental, racial, and gender justice. She's executive director of the Wallace Global Fund, a private foundation which is recognized for its creative philanthropic strategies and mission-related investments to address climate change, advance human rights, and hold corporations accountable to the public good. She has championed transformative change within philanthropy to give more, invest differently, and support and scale movements. She's really an amazing person for us to open proceedings with. Under her leadership, Wallace Global Fund helped seed and grow the global fossil fuel divest movement and launched Divest Invest Philanthropy, a group of 200 foundations committed to deploying their investments to address the climate crisis and accelerate the clean energy transition. And for this work, Ellen was awarded, quite rightly too, the 2016 inaugural Nelson Mandela Gracia Machel Brave Philanthropy Award. She's also received other recognition and awards for her leadership in the philanthropic sector. So with that introduction, Ellen, over to you.
Thanks so much. Gosh, we didn't talk about what bios we were going to use, so quite embarrassing. Hi, everybody. Wish I could see you all. I want to begin with really three fundamental premises to frame my comments, if I may. They're probably pretty obvious too. Climate change is not happening in a vacuum. It's being driven by an economic system where corporations and financial institutions have disproportionate power, exercise deeply over governments, weakening their capacity to respond to the crisis. As governments are less able to regulate, uphold the social contract, pass policies fit for purpose, then finance becomes an even more important lever to use to hold corporations accountable or shape their activities. That is why the climate movement has made finance a central strategy. Second, philanthropy needs to declare a climate emergency. If we were to believe there is a climate emergency, how would we act differently? And are we doing it? Third, philanthropy is not just any investment sector. We have a unique role as mission-driven investors with capacities and assets that can aid in developing and scaling solutions. Philanthropy receives charitable tax status to serve the public good, and our investments should not escape that test. We should not drive harm with our investments that we ask our grantees to solve with a fraction of those assets, the 5%. Nor should we ignore the positive role of our investments can play to seed and scale solutions, reach those the market or government will not or cannot otherwise reach. So if we were to think about how our investments could serve as a vital tool to respond to the climate emergency, what could philanthropy do? First, we could set the bar high for every other investment sector with our own actions as examples. We could set a high target for investing in renewable energy and clean tech, say 15 to 20% of our investment portfolio. We could commit to be net zero, but we could also go further than that and set a public goal that we will not invest in any new fossil fuels, not a penny more. They're already stranded assets, and we can't lock in new fossil fuels at this time. So we need a kind of high ambition coalition of investors that'll say net zero, yes, but net zero without fossil fuels. And we need to use shareholder actions to push for decarbonization of every industry and make sure they're not violating human rights while they're doing it. Second, seed and scale critical initiatives to advance a just transition. We have an opportunity to actually use our investment capital with incredible transformative potential to help aid in the just transition, to reach extractive workers and communities that are displaced with CDFIs, with loan funds and opportunities to build new businesses. We can invest in Indigenous and BIPOC communities that have had disproportionate harm from extraction, from colonialism, and support their enterprises with grants and investment capital, from paying smallholder farmers for the carbon they keep in the ground, to helping the Standing Rock Sioux tribe build a grid-scale wind farm that'll bring revenue to their community. We can help reach the 850 million plus without access to electricity today, where women are leading small businesses to bring renewable energy, distributed renewable energy to the last mile. We can align grants and impact investments, and we should set a goal that will accept fair returns for the projects. Let's decolonize the impact investing. Third, do no harm. Okay, you know I'm going to say it, divest. How can any of you be invested in the companies fighting for decades to deny the science, buy off politicians, continue to pollute our air and heat the planet? If anybody on this call is still invested in fossil fuels, please send me a message. It's not too late. We can help. Hold the renewable sector accountable for human rights and environmental standards. We have a whole new industry coming online. We have an opportunity to shape that industry to be the least harmful it can be. And then bank with banks that don't do bad things. Don't loan to fossil fuels. Don't harm racial, gender, and economic justice. So these are all easy things to say, right? But can you do it? And will you lose your shirt if you do? Very quickly, I'll just say that has not been our experience. We are 100%, we started our journey in 2009. By 2012, so we have a decade now of experience, we are 100% ESG integrated, 100% divested from fossil fuels, 23% invested in climate solutions, renewable energy and clean tech. 2 to 3% of that is for last mile communities. We have 5% invested in high impact investments, where we prioritize working with communities who design projects and design their own desired impacts. We accept a fair or shared return. And then we engage in extensive shareholder advocacy. It did not come at the expense of returns. For the last decade, we have consistently outperformed our benchmarks. We are in the top 10% of all foundations for the last decade of returns, regardless of whether they do mission investing or traditional investing, whether they're large or they're small. Here's the important point. Those extra returns actually enabled us to pay out significantly more. We didn't take those extra returns and put them into growing our endowment. We said we're going to go way above our 5%, because if we believe it's a climate emergency, if we believe we have less than 7 years to fundamentally turn this around, why are we growing investment banks? We aren't just any investor. Put that money to work to support the movements on the front lines, the smart advocacy, and the climate finance movement. So if we're serious about a climate emergency, let's understand our unique role as investors. Let's invest differently. Let's pay out more and raise the bar for other investors. Thanks so much.
Ellen, what a brilliant place to start. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing at Wallace Global Fund and for that opening scene setting for us. So I've got a kind of supplementary question for you here, because I think you've made a very compelling case for delivering mission-related investment and its role in tackling climate change. And great that you've put paid to that old myth that impact investing means concessionary returns. I think your financial performance should be something that everyone on this call should take away, that delivering positive impact does not mean concessionary returns. I want to ask you a question for the leaders on the call who are at the very start of their journey transitioning their organization to deliver urgent action on climate change to deliver impact investing, what's the first practical steps they should take to get going? And how can they get that internal mandate to deliver this work and sell it to their board as you guys did back in 2009?
You know, it's a really good question, and I am truly happy, and I'll put my email in the chat to help anybody on this journey, because it has been so transformative for us as a foundation. Really, the first thing we did, we had the conversation. I sat down with my board and said, come on, we know that we need to align the investments with the grants, and we could do so much more. And they're like, yeah, we know we have other problems. Let's get to it. And then it was 2008 and we lost a third of our assets in the market crash. So it was a good time to rebalance. And so we said, let's do this. But we did research, extensive research. And now there's way more data and case studies that would enable you to bring research to your board about the process, about the returns, about different models of how you could align your investments and at what pace you might be willing to do it. But we were going to do 50%. We went 100% immediately after doing the research. We're like, we can do this. Then we went to our existing fund managers, said, this is what we're going to do. You in or you're out? Quite a few of them were out. We're like, okay, that's all right. We hired new investment consultants with expertise. They helped us identify new funds. We expanded our investment committee and brought some of the leaders of the socially responsible investment field onto our investment committee, and we started the journey. But I want to just say one thing. Really interesting. There were things I didn't expect. I thought we would do cool things with the investments, and we would align the investments somewhat with the grant making. I had no idea about a couple of things. We saved a lot of money, not just made money in the investments, but we saved money in the management of our investments. Because if the truth be told, not all of us are doing the deep dive. And, you know, in some cases we were getting hosed in fees by certain managers. And so we cleaned it up, and it saved a lot of money, and we made a lot of money. Secondly, my board is now exercising their fiduciary duty fully. I'm not saying they weren't before, but let's be clear. If you're dialing in for a quick quarterly investment committee meeting and checking the numbers, is that really embracing your fiduciary duty? But if you're excited and interested in what you're doing with your investments, the board and the investment committee became much more engaged. Third, all of our staff now use finance as a lens in their program areas. And so finance and corporate accountability is a centerpiece now of our strategic work. And as a result, our staff come to investment committee meetings, and our investment committee joins in on a lot of our programmatic work. And so it's way more robust in terms of looking at all the tools we have. And then the last thing I'll say is we became accidental participants in the global social movement when we started our own journey from divesting from fossil fuels in 2009 and helping to seed with grants some of the early student campaigns. And it exploded. And so we ended up being part of something we never expected being part of, and I think arguably playing an important role in it. So this whole process changed us in terms of our impact and even how our theory of change and how we approach our work. So, you know, come on in, the water is fine.
Ellen, you've made the water sound absolutely delightful. And as Amy said on the chat there, if you've got questions for Ellen, please do put them in the chat. We'll be getting to them after we've heard from both Martin and Hill. But our next panel is Martin Rich, and we're very grateful for him joining us today. Martin's a sustainability and impact specialist with over 25 years experience in both mainstream and social investment. So he had a career in international finance with UBS, JP Morgan, HSBC, and social finance. And he co-founded the Future Fit Foundation with a vision to create a truly sustainable future for all. And he now spends his time in a number of pro bono roles, including what he'll really speak to today, which is as the Senior Independent Trustee and Chair of the Endowment Investment Committee for Access Foundation here in the UK. So over to you, Martin.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sarah. Wonderful to see so many people logged on. As Ellen said, shame we can't see you in person, but great that you're all with us. Ellen, you've just done an amazing job of painting the landscape and setting the scene there. So I'm going to waste no time at all repeating anything that Ellen has just said, other than just assume everything she said I completely and utterly agree with. Absolutely fantastic. So let's dig in a little bit to actually how can you do this, or specifically, how did we at Access go through this process? And hopefully that will enable you to take away a few lessons and a few things you can go and start thinking about yourselves for those of you who are early in this journey. Now, Access Foundation has some unique points. We were set up by from an endowment from dormant assets here in the UK. So it was a UK government initiative that created us as an organisation. We had a limited life of 10 years from when we were set up. And most importantly, due to the vision, both within government and also those who were involved in setting Access up on day one, we managed to get a concept of total impact embedded into the very articles of the foundation. So we didn't have to go through the process that many of you might, thinking about, what is the fiduciary responsibility here? Are we able to do this? Now, in a nutshell, I would say yes, absolutely, you are, but that's a side story. For us at Access, we were able to go from day one and use our endowment to maximize the impact in a way that was, to the best of our ability, aligned with the mission of the organisation. Now, the clue is in the title. We are the Foundation for Social Investment in England and Wales. So we had that starting point, but we had that mandate from day one. Now, the team that were involved in the setting up of Access went and did that next stage, again, that Ellen pointed to, which was they brought in people who would be excited about being involved in this. At the time, I was working at Social Finance, the organisation that created the modern wave of social impact bonds, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And within my role there, I was spending my time actually trying to sell these investments to other foundations, to endowments, to high net worth individuals. And suddenly I overheard this conversation about Access being set up, where we were going to have this endowment of about £60 million over 10 years to invest for impact. I think I was on my knees begging those involved to let me be involved, to let me be on the other side of the table for once, to actually have the money and be demanding of the investment managers that it was put to work in this way. And I'm pleased to say that the begging worked, and they let me get involved. So the starting point was to say, what does it mean for us as Access to have a total impact across the portfolio? And to cut a long development story short, we came up with what we call our bullseye approach. And Sarah, I'll ask if you will flick forward in the slides if you've got that one up and ready. And what we created was a way of defining in broad categories where we wanted our capital to go. And at the heart of this bullseye was basically charities and social enterprise that were delivering impact in the UK. Now, we weren't precious about what that impact particularly was. We knew the market would be relatively limited, but we just said any charity or social enterprise that is creating positive impact, there we go on the slide, in the UK, that's where we want to put as much of our capital as possible. Outside of that, the second tier was to say, actually, we're prepared in the investment portfolio as well to step outside of the UK if we need to. So the next tier is just charities and social enterprises, again, delivering impact, but doing it elsewhere in the world. Outside of that, the third tier was to say other organisations delivering social impact, i.e. they could be for-profits, not necessarily charitable legal entities or set up as social enterprises, but nonetheless delivering positive social impact through what they were doing. And then the final tier, we said if we have to move out to a broader sphere, then as a minimum, we want organizations that have best-in-class ESG indicators. Now, there's a lot of debate going on in the world at the moment as to what that means. We can have that conversation if relevant, but for now, just consider it as organizations that had done the best hygiene possible around environmental and social issues. So basically, we said from day one, we don't want anything in the portfolio that's embarrassing at worst, and at best, we want as much of it in that center bullseye point. And as you can see, we've been completely transparent about all the holdings and everything as we've gone through this process. As of the middle of summer this year, you can see the portfolio percentage holdings. 34%, so basically about a third of the portfolio. It's down a little bit from where it was. I think at its peak, it was at about 45%. But we had a third of the portfolio invested in bonds and debt of charities and social enterprises in the UK. And you can read the rest of the numbers from there. If you go to the Access Foundation website, you'll also see the history of all of this. Ellen talked about returns. We've absolutely blown all of the benchmarks that we set ourselves out of the water. Now, we're a spend down portfolio. As I said, we had a limited 10-year life. So we actually limited ourselves in the end to debt, funds and cash. We didn't have any equity investments because we had a spend profile that we wanted to stick to. So we wanted a maturity of assets that would mature, bonds maturing, release the capital, which we could then put into the programs that Access funds. So we didn't have any equities or alternative assets from day one, but we set ourselves benchmarks of cash and LIBOR and 5-year bond rates. We've absolutely blown all of those benchmarks out of the water. I don't know, Ellen, where we would come against a national benchmarking of that, but off the top of my head, our total return over the period has been about 10%, which is incredibly good compared to what we would have got if we'd have just put the money in banks. Now, we do have cash. We obviously have cash coming in and going out. Again, there, we've moved. We started with a mainstream bank, I won't say which one, but we closed the account there, and now all of our accounts are with the charity, social-focused banks in the UK. Again, they're not necessarily perfect, but it was about setting the point that we wanted every single part of our portfolio to be doing as much positive impact as was possible. It's been a great journey, and it's been an absolutely fantastic set of results coming from it. Final point to mention is we're talking about move to environmental, beyond carbon, etc. When we set this portfolio up, it was with a very social focus, but more recently we've wanted to embrace, the board wanted to embrace a move towards net zero. Were we doing everything within the portfolio that we could to move towards this idea of reducing the carbon emissions? But guess what? Because of the way we'd set the portfolio up on day one, we weren't having a massive environmental impact from the get-go. There were no oil companies, there were no coal mines in the portfolio to get rid of. The biggest area we actually have as a carbon impact is all the housing associations that we are invested in. So we're thinking about how can we help and engage with them to be reducing their impact, to be insulating the homes, whatever it would be. Now, we're debt holders, not equity holders, so we have some limited degree of scope to work with them. But actually, by setting up the portfolio 100% mission aligned from day one, we actually didn't then need to go through the difficult transition that so many others have had to, and perhaps those listening will have to think about tackling. But ultimately, when you end up with a portfolio that is fully mission aligned, then I think it's a fantastic place to be, and it's already going to be addressing these issues of climate, just transition, etc., which we'll touch on in a bit. I'll pause there.
Thank you so much for that, Martin. And another superb example of financial return, compelling financial returns being totally compatible with an impact investing strategy. And the bullseye is a very helpful framework, I think, for people coming into this space. Just a shout out to Access's own very detailed breakdown of the case study of that is available on their website, which we excerpted at the Impact Investing Institute. It's a really good insight, detailed insight into the work. And Martin, I had a question for you on that. You've described a very positive story about your transition to total impact. And as an But as an early pioneer, especially within the UK context, I'm sure you've found some obstacles along your way. So I'd love you to speak to a couple of the obstacles that you faced building a total impact portfolio and how you went about overcoming them.
Yeah, I think that the biggest one, when we put this portfolio together 4 or 5 years ago now, and took it out to the market, we had built our own view as to what we thought the portfolio should be constructed of, at least in terms of the profile, debt and cash, etc., rather than obviously not the specific bonds. And when we took that out as a mandate to the market, we were, to be honest, at the time, very disappointed with the level of response we got. The asset managers really didn't understand the idea. Now, I think if we went out today with a new mandate, I think the world has really moved forward, and that's encouraging. And I'd like to think perhaps we played a very small role in helping with that. But the knowledge that managers have these days is so much higher. I think we would get a much greater response. But we had quite a lot of responses coming in that were really very light touch, sort of ESG, responsible investment type things, which really weren't mission aligned at all. But we were able ultimately to whittle it down to a set of 3 managers. Ultimately, as you'll be able to see on the website, we went with Rathbone Investment Management, supported by Rathbone Green Bank on the impact side. Only fair to give a shout out to them. They've done a fantastic job of working with us over the years. As I say, I think they would probably have more of a run for their money in the markets these days. But getting managers to really understand and engage with your mission is a big challenge. And I think there's, if I can perhaps do a segue here for Hill, I think this is an area where the investment consultants themselves have been catching up. Again, I think we go back 5 years ago, we didn't use an investment consultant because bluntly we found the expertise that we'd managed to put together in the room was far greater than anything we could find in the market. And so we didn't really see the value in paying for that service. But I think now the consultancy world is catching up quickly. So I think, you know, the availability of that level of advice is, again, much better than it was when we started on this journey. But the number one starting point I would give for anybody on this journey is build your own internal team through the board and through independent external advisors who will just come on board. There's lots of pro bono folks out there who'd be very, very happy to just roll up their sleeves, join you, be on your side of the table and help you to create the right type of approach.
Really helpful. Thank you for that, Martin. I've seen that there's a question, Stephen Hoodart, on the side on social impact bonds, which we'll get to in the broader Q&A session. So I want to assure you that that's coming down the transom, and I will ask Martin to answer it in due course. But first, before we get into the broader Q&A session, I wanted to introduce Hill Gaston. He is Principal and UK Head of Sustainable Investment in Mercer's Global Sustainable Investment Team, and he's providing advice to sustainable investment leaders on integrating sustainability issues throughout their investment strategy. So he's really going to speak to the practicalities of starting to put into place these climate strategies across portfolios. He's got extensive experience advising a range of institutional investors, including foundations and endowments, obviously on climate change, which he'll be speaking to, but also on stewardship, impact investing and regulatory developments. And he's also contributed to major thought leadership. So 2021's UK-China Green Finance Task Force report, Scaling Sustainable Solutions, Public and Private Markets, and Mercer's Impact Investment Pathways. Hill, over to you.
Great, thank you, and just wanted to echo the 2 other panelists. It's brilliant to be with you today, and it's great to see the interest in this webinar. So thanking Martin and Ellen, I think they've made the really key arguments for actually targeting net zero and impact within your investment strategy, from thinking about the urgency of the climate emergency the ability to actually have emissions alignment so that all of your assets are working towards your overall aims, the ability for philanthropy to really set a very high bar, express a high ambition, scale solutions, and lead on things like the just transition. And then finally, the financial argument. So if we think about climate change, I think we know that there's going to be a massive transformation of our economy, one that's currently addicted to fossil fuels to one that needs to transition to a low carbon version. There'll be physical risks and transition risks inherent in that, and no company is going to be left untouched. So thinking about this from a financial perspective, we believe is really going to benefit you. So if you're sold on these points, I think there are a lot of questions still for foundations and endowments and wider institutional investors around the practical implications. I think investors, in order to align with, say, a net zero target, they need to really be thinking about developing a climate transition plan. And so if we flip to the one slide that we have, this needs to be a plan that really defines clear targets and trajectories. It's a plan that's going to have to encompass not just, say, your listed equities, but the entire portfolio over time. It's one that needs to be long-term in nature, so 10 years and beyond, but really critically as well, it needs to be one that identifies what can and needs to be done today. And so the way that we would approach setting a net zero target, an overall framework for net zero is using what we call our analytics for climate transition framework. The framework itself is really looking to have confidence in answering a number of key questions. So investors need to be able to integrate and understand the potential downside risks they face as a result of a low carbon transition and the physical risks as they come through from climate change, as well as the opportunities. So this ability to actually invest in the companies of the future. Another really key question that investors need to be able to navigate, endowments and foundations need to think about is, if you've set these net zero emission reduction targets, can you still meet your investment objective? And I think we've had a very strong, resounding take on that from the two other panelists before me, that is something that we can do, but we need to think about that in an intelligent way. And the other thing that I'll highlight before I go into the 4 steps of this framework is that, endowments and foundations need to think about how they actually deal with what we define as the gray companies. So these are very high intensive companies with a low potential to transition. So if we think about the steps to actually, get to a coherent net zero plan, there are 4. The first one is really looking at and understanding your emissions baseline today. And this is asking, where are the key carbon and climate risks coming from? Which companies and sectors are actually contributing to your carbon intensity within your portfolio? And for anyone who's already started to do this work, they'll know that often you'll find it's a relatively small number of companies and sectors that are really dominating your carbon footprint. But understanding where you are today is really critical for planning ahead into the future. The second step that we really look to think about are portfolio possibilities, and this is really asking the question around, how do we take a more rounded view, so one that goes beyond just emissions, to understand the actual transition capacity of the portfolio that we're invested in. And what we do here is we help endowments and foundations understand the gray, the green, and the in-between. So the gray are these assets we've already talked about. These are companies that and I'm sure you can think of a number of sectors where a lot of these come from. These are very high carbon intensive companies with low transition potential. The other thing that we look at is try to understand how much of the portfolio today is green. So that's perhaps also intuitive. So those companies that might be focused on renewable energy. And then thirdly, we're looking at those companies that are in the in-between bucket. And these are companies that are a mix of carbon intensities, but they're in sectors that we know we need into the future. And we know that we need them to actually transition their business models to a low carbon version. So essentially, and these are critical, it's critical to use stewardship to help them do that. The third step is really around targets and timings. And this looks to build on the analysis that we've done in steps 1 and 2. So this is looking at, if we're thinking about emissions reduction targets, this is looking at, what, end date to target. Is it 2050 or earlier in terms of net zero? And then also what interim targets should you be setting, say, to 2025 and 2030, so that we have a way of kind of annually assessing this and making sure that we're on track. These targets can obviously go beyond emissions, and we can be thinking about impact objectives and targets and sustainability allocations as well. And finally, building on those first 3 points, we then need, the implementation, and critical to that is having a credible multi-year plan that can be integrated within the wider investment strategy and portfolio construction. Overall, we believe that investors really need to be thinking about the full toolkit when they're approaching and setting net zero targets. So things like sustainable allocations that I've talked about already, that bottom right piece talking about investments, to what extent do you want exposure to climate solutions or wider impact opportunities? Stewardship, so this idea that we need to hold companies to account and make sure that they are transforming their business models. And then finally, integration. So often that's very much focused on risk management, but understanding the extent to which managers are really thinking about these ESG risks in the companies that they're choosing.
Hill, thank you so much for that overview. I'm conscious of the time, and it's 3:40. We've got 20 minutes to go, so that's a reminder as much to me as to my panelists. I've got a question for Hill, and then we'll open up. There's been a few that have come through the Q&A, but please do get your questions in now should you want to ask them. I'm really interested in the human side of getting these strategies underway, and it's the question, the Mercer side of the question I asked Ellen earlier. I've got a £500 million endowment, and I've invested without impact considerations. I've come to today's session, I've heard from Ellen, I've heard Martin, and now I want to go 100% impact. What's the journey for the client that with you to deliver on the ambition? What's the conversation you have? You've talked about the sort of almost the practicalities of the transition pathway itself, but I'd be really interested, what are the considerations you think those foundations need to take into account as they start this journey with you?
Great. I think that's a brilliant question, and one that we get asked a lot. The way I would come back, I think there are 4 key areas to really work through to kind of take a whole of portfolio approach, and I think a whole of portfolio approach is appropriate, one that is cohesive and holistic. And essentially these 4 areas are what captured in what we call our sustainable investment pathway. So the 4 areas are belief, policy, processes, and portfolio. So if we think of the first one, I think it's well worth spending the time to think about what your beliefs are across different topics and different areas. And I spend a fair amount of my time running belief sessions with investors to understand where there's broad consensus on what their beliefs are and where there's disagreement. It's really, really foundational. And if we apply the impact lens, I think we then need to quickly start asking, which are the key themes that we really, really want to target and be focused on within our portfolio. Do we have a products and service angle to this? Is it more about ESG integration and operations, etc.? The second thing is around policy. So again, this one can feel a little bit boring at times, but actually formally capturing what your approach is and putting that into a document, making that public to various stakeholders, I think is incredibly important. Next, we have process. And so we can be thinking about what the investment managers that we're employing are doing in terms of ESG integration and stewardship. But again, if we bring in that impact element, let's say it's on the social side, I think processes that you're focused on need to be thinking about the impact measurement. So which types of impact are you looking to measure, which people groups, if we've got a social element to it as well. And then that fourth element is portfolio, and again, this is one of those areas where if you actually don't express your beliefs, your policy, and your processes and bring that into your portfolio, you've really failed. But this is looking across a number of areas here to make sure that we're actually investing in the right themes, in the right impact strategies, looking at public versus private and various areas there. And this whole process, the beliefs, the policy process, and portfolio, it's iterative. It's something that we keep revisiting. But if investors take those 4 stages really, really seriously, you can actually transform the way that you think about impact, think about, say, the social themes that are most important to you, the environmental themes, and ultimately you can bring that into your portfolio as well.
Really helpful. I guess, Hill, that's not going to be the last time I use your 4-part articulation. So thank you so much. So now we are going to go into the Q&A. We've had 4 questions in across the transom. This is probably last call for more questions. So a first one, this is directed at Martin from Stephen Huddart. And it's quite a simple yes or no one. Has Access invested in social impact bonds or outcomes funds? And also, what about aggregating your investments thematically for greater impact? Thoughts there?
Yep. No, we haven't invested in SIBs directly, primarily because we needed the certainty of the cash flow return, which SIBs obviously can't give you because they're outcome based. Plus, at the time we were putting the portfolio together, there weren't actually any available. They could have theoretically been sat within some of the funds, the aggregated funds that we've invested in, but to my knowledge of anything that's there, they're not. But again, that's primarily around the sort of the risk return characteristics. They're more equity-like than bond-like. So hence we're not in any of those. But that's not for any moral judgments on them. Aggregating, if by that you mean sort of like aggregating with others, in principle, again, that's something that would have been nice to be able to do, but because of the way the funds were granted to us as coming out of dormant assets and all the rest of it, I really won't bore you all with all the details. There were some limits around what we were able to do, sort of commingling, etc. And again, because of the profile that we had, that wasn't an appropriate route for us to take. But I think for those who don't have those restrictions, and particularly who are permanent endowments or ongoing endowments, I think that's a fantastic route to go down. Look at what the Snowball Alliance have done. I think they've done a brilliant job here in the UK of pulling together assets that together, as you say, can create greater impact just through the mass.
Really helpful. Thank you so much for that, Martin. Ellen, I've got a question from Kathy Smith here that I'd love your thoughts on. It's because it chimes really with your point around renewable energy and ensuring that the future growth of that industry is just. Kathy says, how do you overcome ethical decisions about who to invest in, such as investing in battery or cell development for renewable energies, which rely on metals such as nickel, cobalt, and lithium, which currently need to be mined? Would you invest in mining companies, for example? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a really complicated one. When we started back in 2009, our investment journey, I didn't go into a lot of the details on a short call, but we made a commitment to both get out of certain sectors and then invest best in class in other sectors and use shareholder engagement. And as a way to move some of those industries to be as the highest standard possibly for environment and human rights. And so we got out of mining from the jump. But now there is a crucial moment in terms of the various minerals and metals and requirements for the batteries, where I think we need more of a coalition that's targeting these issues and also, figuring out ways to use investor pressure and to support communities to ensure that communities, rights to free, prior, and informed consent, that they're protected in terms of environmental impacts and human rights impacts. And there are a number of organizations that are working on that. And please feel free to reach out if you're interested in making grants to support some of those organizations really pushing on standards for the ethical battery, as it were, and campaigning on that. So it's a good example of not having the silo of the investments, even if they're mission aligned investments, and grants, because you can really use the grants to help move an industrial sector along, as well as use your shareholder voice. And I'll just say, because this is something that Sarah asked a question about as well in the chat around the blended, I'm not answering the full question, but around the blended approach. The same with impact investments. It's really important to think about how you can use your grants as a way to help get a project to scale, whether it's technical assistance, paying for certain project costs, development costs. So thinking again about just break that wall down between the investments and grants, and you'll be able to go on a more robust journey on the impact investing side. And maybe we could even come back and here's an idea for Alliance, come back and have a webinar about the human rights and environmental impacts of the renewable sector and how we address them.
Well said, Ellen. I saw a hand up there from you, Martin.
Yeah, just wanted to add, for the benefit of particularly of the UK listeners, the recent Butler-Schloss ruling on can you align a charitable foundation portfolio for environmental purposes aligned with your mission. The answer came back, thankfully, a resounding yes. You can. There are certain steps you need to go through to make sure that you do stay aligned with your fiduciary duty, but absolutely you can do that. The one thing that the judge did say in that case was that you cannot invest purely on moral and ethical grounds. The board cannot impose their own morals and ethics as a standalone on the portfolio. If it's aligned with your mission, if it's something that would potentially alienate your supporters or the other work that you're doing, all of that is fine. But pure moral and ethical things, stands and viewpoints need to be carefully avoided. It's a subtlety, but just raise that because it's obviously very relevant in the UK right now, because that's the latest legal guidance. I'll dig out a link and put it in the website in the chat. But any UK listeners should just make themselves aware of exactly what that ruling does and doesn't say.
Just a quick one. I'm aware we've only got 9 minutes left and I want to get through as much as possible. So there's a question here from Judd Scott Leicester Sims. Is any of the panel aware of the Green Hedging Currency Initiative? And would you guys like to comment on that? The answer may be no. So I think there's broad no's. So Judd, I'm afraid we've not got a comment for you there. This is a question that's perhaps best parried by Hill. Around carbon credits. What willingness is there to invest in projects on carbon credits with benefits shared between the investor and community? And that's from Charles Appleby. What role are carbon credits playing in the portfolios you're building, Hill?
I think it's a really good question. I think if you ask me in 5 years' time, it'll be playing a much bigger role. So I think there are a number of points to make on credits and offsets more generally. So one of the key points I would say, if you look at the IPCC scenarios, even those that decarbonize quite sharply from here, there is a role for offsetting. So that is something that will come into play. I think generally, as we approach net zero with our clients, we're trying to emphasize decarbonization or real world decarbonization, but also we're seeing continued or increased interests in the offsetting side. It's something to keep exploring. But more generally, I think there's some key issues on the offsets, one of which is the quality of offsets. Secondly, is this issue around, are investors going to abuse them and kind of offset instead of actually decarbonizing? And then we're also at a position where, as a market, I don't think they're ready to scale. But it's definitely an area that investors are thinking about. And actually, as biodiversity increasingly comes into the fore, and actually, I think we're going to see an accelerating focus on biodiversity alongside climate change. Again, you're going to see more and more interest in offsets through things like sustainable forestry. So starting to see the interest. There are limitations around the overall offset market, but yeah, it's definitely going to grow in the future.
Thank you so much for that, Hill. I'm afraid as we're 6 minutes to the hour, that's the full time that we have questions for. Stephen Lewin, you ask a great question on whether impact portfolios can be built around issues like children and young people, homelessness and social mobility. I would say, as I'm hidebound to the Impact Investing Institute, you can certainly build robust risk-adjusted market rate return portfolios around almost any impact issue. It's really just starting on the journey, and there are lots of resources on the Impact Investing Institute. I've put some URLs in the chat, but also Alliance is a really wonderful resource to kind of keep developing your learning. So I just want to go to close, really, a word from each of our brilliant panelists. Just, what today has been your, key takeaway from the session today. Mindful that you've basically got a minute each. Ellen, kick us off.
Key takeaways. There's no time for business as usual. This isn't something we should tinker with. We need to use every tool at our disposal. Our grants, our investments, our advocacy voice, our networks to move urgently on the climate emergency and pay out more. What are you squirreling away your acorns for? Could there be a colder winter than what we're about to approach?
Thank you for that, Ellen. I think you're right. The acorns need to be planted ASAP. Martin, from you, thoughts?
I love that, and absolutely. If you are a fiduciary to the assets of your organization, it is your duty to use 100% of those to the best of your ability to further your mission, period. And therefore, if you are not using your financial assets to achieve that, I think you're actually in breach of your duties. You should absolutely be considering every single aspect of this, as Ellen has just said. There is nothing to stop you doing so these days. The market is now pretty sophisticated to help you start making steps. The law is on your side. You can absolutely do it. To the gentleman who asked the question, yes, you can do it around those specific things. There are no mission topics that you can't align this around. What that would look like will be different, but don't let the specific issues stop you. Go and find that advice. Go to the places that Sarah's already referred to. Look at the Access website and get on with it.
A great call to action. And Hill, from Mercer's perspective, what was your key takeaway today?
Yeah, I think it's a challenge. It's a challenge for each of us to ask ourselves, how can we actually raise our impact ambition? How do we actually ensure that all of our capital is invested to further our mission? We've talked about various ways where we can have our cake and eat it. So, if we're talking about financial returns, if we're talking about mission alignment, we're talking about acting in a way that we know is going to benefit the future. And so, I think there's some really, really practical questions we can ask ourselves. Do we need to revisit our beliefs? Do we need more training, or do you actually need to start exploring the impact fund universe that is available to foundations and endowments? The urgency to act is there, but so is the opportunity.
And on that stirring call to action, I'd really love to thank multiple parties for this brilliant call. I hope you who've joined us have enjoyed today's discussion. Huge thanks to Martin, Hill and Ellen for giving of their time and the work that they're doing to build this market, to build these approaches and really act as pioneers for others to follow. The market is not in the place that it was when Access started, when Wallace started. They have created this space where now it's easy for foundations to step into to get risk adjusted market rate return and deliver positive impacts. So please do, as Alan said, come on in, the water's lovely. A huge thank you to our partners at Mercer for making the event possible. And of course, to the Alliance team behind the scenes, Amy McGoldrick, a special shout out to you for organising us all and getting us all here. And most of all, thanks to you all for being here today with us and being part of the important conversation. So the next Alliance event will be on the 15th of September on decolonising philanthropy, also sponsored by Mercer, and you can register on the Alliance events page. Until then, thanks for joining us and goodbye.